King Edward III needed arrows. It was the 1340s, and his war in France was consuming men and material at an astonishing rate. The English longbow had proven itself a superior weapon, but a longbow was useless without a constant massive supply of arrows. An archer could shoot 10 to 12 arrows a minute, meaning a force of 5,000 archers could unleash 60,000 arrows in 60 seconds. The logistics were staggering. The workshops of London and the smaller towns could not keep up. So, the king turned to conscription, not just for soldiers, but for craftsmen. In 1341, a royal right was sent to the sheriffs of England's counties. It demanded they find and send hundreds of skilled artisans to the Tower of London. These men were not soldiers, they were fletchers. Their name came from the old French word for arrow, fletcher. They were the men who made the ammunition for England's war machine. One such man might have been John from a village in Yorkshire. He wasn't a lord or a knight. He was John the Fletcher. His trade was his identity. He knew how to select straight-grained ash or aspen, how to season it for months until it was strong and light. He knew how to plane it by hand into a perfectly balanced shaft 3 feet long. He knew that the best feathers came from the gray goose and that you must only use feathers from the same wing, left or right, to give the arrow a true spin in flight. He would glue them in place with a resin made from boiled animal skins and bind them with fine silk thread. He would buy the iron arrowheads from the local smith, fitting the sharp bodkin points designed to pierce French mail. For this work, he was known simply as John the Flechier. He and hundreds like him were uprooted from their lives by the king's demand. They were paid a few pence a day and worked from dawn until dusk in vast organized workshops, turning out arrows by the thousand. Sheaf after sheaf, each holding 24 arrows, was packed into barrels and loaded onto ships bound for France. John's son, perhaps born while he was away, would have been known in the village as William, son of the Fletcher. In time, that description would shorten, it would stick, he would become William Fletcher, his family's name forever would be a record of what his father did. It was a story repeated all across the country. A man's work was who he was, and that identity became his legacy. Number 10, your name is Fletcher because someone in your family knew which feathers to use. Thomas Fletcher sat on a low stool in his workshop. The year was 1351. The small town in Nottinghamshire was quieter than it had been a few years ago. The great pestilence had taken many, leaving gaps in families and in the fields. But the demand for his work had not lessened. If anything, it had grown. The king always needed arrows. Thomas was a master Fletcher, a maker of arrows, and his trade was one of deadly importance. And his father had been a Fletcher, and his father before him. The name had become fixed to their family about a century ago. Before that, they were just Thomas of the Dale, or whatever place they lived. But the Fletcher's craft was so specific, so vital, that the title became the man. To be a Fletcher was to be the arrow maker. It separated him from the bowyer who made the bow, and the stringer who made the string of hemp or sinew. It was a trinity of crafts, all in service of the archer. The workshop was a long, narrow room attached to his small house. It was filled with the clean scent of wood shavings and the faint animal smell of glue simmering over a small charcoal brazier. Racks along the walls held bundles of wood, all in various stages of seasoning. This was the foundation of his craft. He used ash mostly for its strength and straight grain. He would buy the timber in rough staves from a woodcutter who knew exactly what he looked for. It had to be free of knots and imperfections. Once in his shop, the wood would sit for months, sometimes years, to season properly. Green wood would warp, and a warped arrow was a useless arrow. An archer's life depended on a straight shot. Today, Thomas was working on a sheaf of arrows, 24 of them, for a local man-at-arms who served the nearby lord. He picked up a seasoned ash stave. It felt light but strong in his calloused hands. With a small hand axe, he roughly shaped it, then took it to his shaving horse. He sat astride the bench, using a foot pedal to clamp the wood in place. He picked up his draw knife, a two-handled blade, and began to pull it towards himself, peeling away long, thin curls of wood. The work was rhythmic, a constant pull and release. He worked the wood down until it was a perfectly round shaft, about half an inch thick and a cloth yard long, the standard length. He would check its straightness constantly, sighting down its length like a hunter, aiming a spear, any deviation, and he would have to start again. Once the shaft, or steel, was perfect, he moved to the next step. He cut a small, precise knock at one end. This was the groove where the bowstring would sit. It had to be smooth, so it wouldn't fray the string, but deep enough to hold securely. A slip here could cause the arrow to fall from the bow at the crucial moment of drawing. Then came the fletching, the part of the process that gave his family its name. For this, he kept a large sack of goose feathers. Gray goose feathers were the best. He had to buy them from poultry keepers, and they were not cheap. The real skill was in how they were prepared and applied. He would strip the vein from one side of the quill, leaving a neat, stiff edge of feather. For each arrow, he needed 3, and all 3 had to come from the same wing of the bird. He kept 2 piles, one for left wing feathers, one for right. Using feathers from the same wing ensured the arrow would spin in a consistent direction during flight, giving it stability and accuracy. Mixing them would make the arrow fly erratically. It was a detail few people outside the craft understood, but it was the difference between a master's arrow and a shoddy one. He took 3 prepared feathers and carefully spaced them around the shaft, just below the knock. He dipped a small brush into the pot of hot glue. It was a powerful adhesive he made himself by boiling down animal hides and sinew. The smell was strong, but he was used to it. He applied a thin layer of glue to the base of each feather and pressed it firmly onto the wood. To secure them further, he took a fine silk thread waxed for strength and began to bind the feathers to the shaft. The wrapping was tight and even, a testament to years of practice. The final component was the head. Thomas Fletcher did not make arrowheads. That was the work of a smith. He had a working relationship with a man named William Smith in the next street. William forged the heads from iron. Thomas would buy them in batches of 100 or more. There were different types for different purposes. For this order, he was fitting bodkin points. These were long, narrow, square-section spikes of hardened iron. They were not designed to cut, but to punch through armor. A broadhead, with its wide, sharp blades, was good for hunting, causing massive bleeding in an animal. But against a man in a mail shirt or a breastplate, a broadhead would just flatten or skip off. A bodkin, propelled by the immense power of a yew-long bow, could pierce right through. Thomas would heat the tang of the arrowhead, the small metal spike at its base, until it was glowing red, or he would then push it into the end of the wooden shaft. The hot metal burned its way into the wood, creating a tight, secure fit that would not come loose on impact. As the metal cooled, it contracted, locking itself in place. To make a single perfect arrow took a long time. A skilled Fletcher like Thomas could perhaps finish a dozen in a day if he worked hard and had all his materials prepared. This sheaf of 24 would take him 2 full days of focused labor. For his work, he would be paid a shilling for the sheaf. A shilling was a good amount of money, the equivalent of what a skilled laborer might earn in 3 or 4 days. But his costs were high. The wood, the feathers, the silk, the glue, and especially the iron heads all cost money. His profit was modest, but his living was steady. The trade was governed by guilds in the larger cities like London and York. The Worshipful Company of Fletchers in London set standards for quality and trained apprentices. An apprenticeship lasted 7 years. A boy would start by doing simple tasks like preparing glue or sorting feathers. He would slowly learn to shape the shafts, and only after years of practice would he be allowed to fletch and head the arrows himself. And it was a long, hard education to ensure the quality of English arrows never faltered. Thomas had served his own apprenticeship under his father, learning every secret of the craft. He knew how the grain of the wood should feel, the precise angle to set the feathers, the exact temperature for fitting the head. These were things that couldn't be written down in a book. They were learned through touch, sight, and countless repetitions. The name Fletcher was more than just a label. It was a sign of a specific, crucial skill. When a man-at-arms or an archer bought arrows from Thomas Fletcher, he was buying the confidence that they would fly true. In a battle, that confidence was everything. The name itself was a guarantee of quality, a legacy forged in wood, feather, and iron, and passed down from one generation to the next. Number 9. Your name is Smith, because an ancestor was the most important person in the village. Robert Smith wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of a grimy hand, leaving a black streak across his forehead. The heat from the forge was immense, a living thing that pulsed in the dark, smoky workshop. It was the year 1285 in a small village in Lincolnshire. Robert was the village blacksmith, a position of immense importance. His surname was not yet a fixed hereditary thing for all families, but for him it was already his identity. He was Robert the Smith. Everyone in the village, from the lord in the manor house to the poorest farmer, depended on him. His forge was the heart of the village. It was a simple structure, a stone hearth with a hood to draw the smoke up through a hole in the thatched roof. Next to it stood the bellows, a large, two-handled contraption made of wood and leather. His apprentice, a boy of 14 named John, was pumping the handles, forcing a steady stream of air into the bed of glowing charcoal. The charcoal hissed and flared, turning from orange to a brilliant, almost white heat. The smithy was a place of noise and power, the roar of the fire, the rhythmic wheezing of the bellows, and the sharp, ringing clang of hammer on anvil. Robert's work was varied and endless. He was not a specialist like a swordsmith or an armorer in a great city. He was a general craftsman, the original jack of all trades. His primary job was to serve the agricultural needs of the community. This morning he was making a new plowshare for a farmer named Walter. The old one had struck a rock and cracked. Without a plow, Walter's fields could not be tilled, and his family would go hungry. The whole village economy was based on the harvest, and the harvest depended on the plow. The plow, in turn, depended on Robert Smith. He took a piece of bloom iron, a rough, spongy lump bought from a traveling merchant who sourced it from iron-producing areas like the Forest of Dean. You know, it was not pure steel, but it was the best he could get. Using a long pair of tongs, he thrust the iron into the heart of the fire. He watched it intently, judging the color of the metal. He waited until it glowed a bright yellow-white, the point at which it was soft and malleable. With a grunt, he heaved the heavy piece from the fire and swung it onto the massive iron anvil that dominated the center of the room. "Now, boy!" he shouted to his apprentice over the noise. John dropped the bellows and grabbed a smaller sledgehammer. Robert held the iron in place with his tongs in one hand and wielded his own heavy hammer in the other. He struck the first blow, a loud, clear ring that echoed through the village. John followed, his strike landing a fraction of a second later. It was a practiced rhythm, a deafening duet of steel on steel. Sparks flew in every direction, dancing in the dim light. They worked quickly, beating the rough lump into a flat, triangular shape before the iron cooled and hardened. The air was thick with the smell of hot metal and coal smoke. After several heatings and hammerings, the plowshare began to take its final form. The skill was not just in brute force, but in knowing exactly where and how hard to strike, to draw the metal out, to shape it into a durable, sharp edge that could slice through the heavy soil. For the cutting edge, he used a more expensive piece of steel, which he would fire weld onto the iron body. This process, called lamination, created a tool that was strong but not brittle, with an edge that could hold its sharpness. It was a technique passed down from smith to smith over generations, but his work didn't end with plows. He made and repaired everything the village needed that was made of metal. He forged the iron rims for the wheelwright's carts, the nails for the carpenter's new barn, the hinges and latches for every door. He made scythes and sickles for the harvest, axes for the woodcutters, and cooking pots and trivets for the women. He even did delicate work like making needles and fishhooks. In the evening, he might be called upon by the reeve to fix the lock on the village stocks. He was also the village farrier, the one who shod the lord's horses and the farmer's oxen. The skill of hot shoeing, nailing a red-hot iron shoe to a horse's hoof, was a specialized and dangerous art that few other than a smith possessed. Because of his unique skills, the smith held a special place in the village hierarchy. He was not a peasant who owed labor service in the fields. He was a free craftsman. He often held a larger plot of land than his neighbors, and his income was more stable. He was paid for his work, sometimes in coin, but more often in kind of bushel of wheat, a side of bacon, a few chickens. His trade gave him a degree of independence and respect that few others enjoyed. There was also a mystique about the smith. He was a master of fire and metal, transforming rough, dark earth into useful, gleaming tools. This ability seemed like a form of magic to his uneducated neighbors. He controlled one of the classical elements, fire. He could make metal soft as clay and then hard as stone. Folklore was full of tales of smiths who could forge magical swords or outwit the devil. This association with the supernatural gave the smith an aura of power and sometimes fear. That he was a man you did not want to cross. The surname Smith became the most common in England for a simple reason: every single village and every castle and monastery had at least one smith. While there might be only one Fletcher or one cooper in a region, smiths were everywhere. The name originated from the Old English word smid, meaning one who works with metal. As surnames began to be adopted in the 12th and 13th centuries, a man's occupation was the most obvious way to identify him. So Robert the Smith became Robert Smith. His son would be known as John Smith, even if he didn't follow his father into the trade. The name was so common that variations arose to be more specific. A smith who specialized in making things from gold became a goldsmith. One who worked with tin was a tinsmith. A man who made knives was a knifesmith. But the original, the powerful, all-encompassing title was simply smith. It was a name that signified strength, utility, and the absolute essential nature of the craft that built the medieval world. Number 8. Your name is Cooper because your ancestor made the internet of the Middle Ages. In the bustling port of Bristol, in the year 1422, a man named Adam Cooper stood amidst a chaotic scene of noise, work, and commerce. Ships with tall masts were tied up at the quay, their hulls heavy with wine from Gascony. Dockworkers rolled massive barrels down wooden planks, the deep rumbling sound a constant backdrop to the shouts of sailors and merchants. Adam was not a sailor or a merchant. He was a cooper, a maker of barrels. And the barrels he made were the foundation of this entire enterprise. Without him and men like him, medieval trade on this scale would have been impossible. The cooper's craft was one of immense skill and precision. A barrel, or a cask, was far more than just a wooden container. It was a marvel of engineering. It had to be strong enough to hold hundreds of pounds of goods, perfectly sealed to contain liquids without leaking a single drop, and shaped in such a way that a single man could roll and maneuver it. In an age before standardized boxes, plastic wrap, or refrigerated trucks, the barrel was the shipping container, the storage unit, and the preservation vessel all in one. It was the internet of its day, a physical network that connected producers and consumers across vast distances. Adam's workshop, not far from the docks, was a hive of activity. The air was filled with the scent of oak, and the smoke from the small fires used to shape the wood. His apprentices were hard at work, their movements honed by years of repetition. The process began with the wood. For wine barrels, nothing but oak would do. Oak was strong, and the tannins in the wood imparted a desirable flavor to the wine during its long sea journey. Adam bought his oak in thick, rough sawn planks, sourced from forests known for their quality. The first step was to cut these planks into staves, the long, curved pieces that form the body of the barrel. This was not simple sawing. Each stave had to be precisely shaped, wider in the middle, and tapering towards the ends. The angle of the bevel on the sides was the most critical part. If it was off by even a fraction of an inch, the barrel would leak. Adam used a specialized tool, a long-bladed adze, to shape each stave by hand, checking the curve and angle with a practiced eye. Once a full set of staves was ready, perhaps 30 or more for a large cask, the assembly began. An apprentice would stand the staves up inside a metal hoop, arranging them in a circle. At this stage, it looked like a splayed wooden crown. The real magic came next. They would place this loose arrangement of staves over a small, smoldering fire of wood chips. The heat, combined with water splashed on the inside, would create steam, making the rigid oak pliable. As the wood softened, Adam and his journeyman would place a heavy iron hoop over the top ends of the staves and, using hammers and specialized drivers, force it downwards. The pressure from the hoop, combined with the carefully calculated shape of the staves, pulled the wood together, creating the distinctive bulging shape of the barrel. More hoops were added, hammered down until the joints between the staves were so tight you couldn't slip a knife blade between them. This process, called trussing, required immense strength and a deep understanding of the wood's properties. Too much heat and the wood would scorch, not enough, and it would crack under the pressure. Adam could read the wood like a scholar reads a book, knowing just how much it would bend before it broke. After the body was formed, he would cut a groove, called a crows, around the inside of each end. This was where the flat barrel heads would sit. Making the heads was another challenge. They were made from several flat pieces of oak, joined together with dowels, and sealed with rushes placed in the joints to swell when wet, creating a perfect seal. The heads had to be cut into a perfect circle to fit snugly into the crows. A finished barrel was a thing of beauty and utility. It was incredibly strong. The curved shape meant that impacts were distributed across the entire structure. It could be stored on its side, and with a gentle push, a 500-pound barrel of wine could be rolled along the ground by one man. This was revolutionary for logistics. It allowed goods to be moved and stacked with an efficiency that was unmatched by any other form of container. Adam Cooper's work was not limited to wine casks. He made barrels for everything. Olive and cider were stored and transported in barrels. Salted fish and meat, essential provisions for long sea voyages and for surviving the winter, were packed in brine-filled barrels. Water for ships was kept in barrels, but even dry goods like flour, nails, and gunpowder were shipped in barrels, which kept them dry and secure. The very name, Cooper, came from the Middle Dutch word Cooper, meaning tub or container. Coopers were highly respected craftsmen, and their guilds were powerful. The Coopers' Company of London, for example, was established in the 13th century and controlled the trade with an iron fist. They set prices, inspected the quality of work, and limited the number of apprentices to keep standards high and wages fair. A master cooper, like Adam, was a prosperous man. The demand for his product was constant and lucrative. A single large wine barrel called a tun, which could hold 252 gallons, was an expensive item. Its cost was a significant part of the final price of the wine. The name Cooper then speaks of an ancestor who was central to the flow of medieval life. He wasn't just a woodworker. He was a logistician, an engineer, and a vital link in the great chain of commerce that stretched from the vineyards of France to the taverns of England. His work made it possible to drink wine in London, to feed sailors in the Atlantic, and to move the basic materials of life from where they were made to where they were needed. The name is a testament to a craft that built the containers that built the pre-modern world. Number 7, your name is right, because your ancestor was a master of wood and wheels. In a workshop on the edge of a market town in Suffolk around the year 1380, a man named Walter Wright surveyed his latest creation. It was a new long-bodied cart commissioned by a wealthy wool merchant. The cart was a testament to his skill, a complex assembly of wood and iron that would soon be hauling valuable fleeces to the coast for shipment to Flanders. Walter was a Wright. The name from the Old English Writa meant a worker or shaper, usually of wood. It was a broad term, but one that carried with it a sense of mastery and ingenuity. Unlike a simple carpenter who might build a rough shed or a fence, a Wright was a more specialized and skilled craftsman. The name often came with a prefix that described a specific type of work. A man who built ships was a shipwright, and one who made plays or stage sets was a playwright, Walter's specialty, and the most common reason for the surname was the making of carts and wagons. He was a cartwright, and within that craft, he was also a wheelwright, a master of the most complex and crucial component of any wheeled vehicle. The cart in his workshop was a piece of practical art. The frame was made of solid oak, chosen for its strength and resistance to rot. The side panels were elm, which was less prone to splitting. Walter had shaped and joined these massive timbers using mortise and tenon joints, cutting a hole the mortise in one piece of wood and a corresponding tongue, the tenon, on another. He pegged them together with wooden dowels. There were very few nails used in the main frame. The entire structure was held together by the precision of its joinery. This made it strong, but also gave it a slight flexibility, allowing it to handle the rough, rutted tracks that passed for roads. But the true measure of Walter's skill was in the 4 wheels on which the cart stood. Making a wheel was a craft in itself, one that took a 7-year apprenticeship to learn and a lifetime to perfect. A medieval wheel was a composite structure made of 3 different types of wood, each chosen for its specific properties. The hub, or nave, at the center of the wheel was made from a tough, dense wood like elm that could resist splitting when the spokes were driven into it. Walter would start with a solid block of seasoned elm and use an auger and chisel to hollow out the center for the axle. Then he would painstakingly chisel out a dozen or more rectangular mortises around the outside of the hub, all angled with geometric precision. The spokes were made of oak, chosen for its straight grain and immense compressive strength. Each spoke had to be shaped perfectly, with a tenon at one end to fit into the hub's mortise and a wider flattened end to fit into the rim. Driving the spokes into the hub was a critical high-tension moment. Walter would hammer them in one by one, the tight fit creating an incredibly strong, rigid core. The rim, or felloes, was made of ash, which was strong but also flexible enough to be bent into a curve. The rim was not a single piece of wood. It was made of several curved sections, each one corresponding to 2 or 3 spokes. And Walter would carefully cut and shape each felloe, drilling holes for the spokes and ensuring the ends were perfectly square to join with the next section. Assembling the wheel was a job that required both brute force and a delicate touch. Once the spokes were set in the hub, the felloes were fitted onto the ends of the spokes. The whole assembly had to be perfectly round and flat, or true. A wobbly wheel would quickly tear itself apart on the road. The final step was the most dramatic. This was the job of the smith, who worked in partnership with the wright. The smith would forge a long, flat iron band or tire. The length of this tire had to be calculated perfectly, just slightly smaller in circumference than the wooden wheel. The smith would heat the entire iron tire in a large circular fire until it was glowing red hot. Then, in a rush of coordinated activity, Walter and his assistants would carry the wooden wheel and lay it on a stone platform. The smith and his helpers would quickly bring the red-hot iron tire with giant tongs, place it over the wooden rim, and with heavy hammers, beat it down into place. The intense heat would char the wood, filling the air with acrid smoke. They would then douse the entire wheel with buckets of cold water. The sudden cooling caused the iron tire to shrink, compressing all the wooden joints of the wheel with immense force. This was what gave the wheel its incredible strength and durability. It was a loud, smoky, and dangerous process that required perfect timing. Walter the Wright was not just building objects, he was enabling commerce, agriculture, and even warfare. His farm carts allowed peasants to haul their harvests from the fields. His merchant wagons carried the wool that was the source of England's wealth. The military relied on his baggage carts to supply armies on the march. A Wright's work was everywhere. The surname Wright, therefore, points to an ancestor who was a problem solver, a practical engineer with a deep intuitive knowledge of materials. He understood the properties of different woods, the principles of leverage, and the geometry of a perfect circle. He was a respected member of the community, a free craftsman whose skills were in constant demand. While a smith worked with fire and metal, the Wright worked with wood, the most common and versatile building material of the age. The name signifies a legacy of construction, of shaping the raw materials of the forest into the tools and vehicles that allowed medieval society to move and to build. Number 6, your name is Taylor because your ancestor decided how rich you looked. Eleanor Taylor sat hunched over a long wooden table, her needle flashing in the light from the open workshop window. It was 1486, and the city of London was abuzz with the new Tudor dynasty. Fashions were changing, and for Eleanor, a master tailor, this was good for business. And she was finishing a doublet for a wealthy merchant, a garment made of expensive crimson wool lined with fine linen. The precision of her stitches, small and almost invisible, was the hallmark of her trade and the reason for her family's name. The surname Taylor comes from the Anglo-French word tailleur, which itself derives from the Latin talier, meaning to cut. And cutting was the heart of the tailor's art. Anyone could sew a seam, but only a true tailor knew how to cut the cloth. This was the skill that separated a maker of simple peasant tunics from a creator of high fashion for the wealthy. In Eleanor's time, clothing was the most visible and immediate indicator of a person's social status. The laws of the land, known as sumptuary laws, even dictated who could wear what. Only nobility could wear cloth of gold or purple silk. The merchant class was restricted to certain types of wool and colors. A peasant was expected to wear simple, undyed homespun wool or rough linen. A person's entire identity, their wealth, their profession, their place in the rigid social hierarchy was displayed on their back. The tailor was the one who created these displays. Eleanor's workshop was a busy place. Bolts of cloth were stacked on shelves, heavy English wools in a rainbow of colors, finer linens imported from the Low Countries, and for her richest clients, velvets and silks from Italy. The tools of her trade were simple but specialized sharp iron shears for cutting, needles of various sizes made of steel or bone, thimbles to protect her fingers, and a heavy goose, a large solid iron used for pressing seams flat. The process of making the merchant's doublet was complex. It began with the measurement. Eleanor didn't use a measuring tape as we know it. She used strips of parchment marking lengths with notches. She would measure the client's chest, waist, arm length, and shoulders with a practiced hand. These measurements were her secret. A good fit was what distinguished her work. Then came the cutting. This was the moment of highest risk and skill. The crimson wool was incredibly expensive, the cost of a single bolt enough to feed a poor family for months. A mistake with the shears was a disaster. She would lay the cloth out on her cutting table and, using chalk, draw the pattern pieces directly onto the fabric. The shapes were complex, a jigsaw puzzle of sleeves, body panels, and collars. The cut had to be precise, accounting for the way the fabric would stretch and hang. This knowledge of how to translate a two-dimensional piece of cloth into a three-dimensional garment that flattered the human form was the tailor's genius. Once cut, the pieces were handed to her apprentices and journeymen for the long process of sewing. The seams were sewn by hand with waxed linen thread. But a tailored garment was more than just a shell. It was structured from the inside out. Eleanor's team would layer different materials to create the desired shape. The chest of the doublet was padded with layers of canvas and horsehair, stitched together in a process called quilting, to create the fashionable, powerful silhouette that men of status desired. The buttonholes, dozens of them running up the front, were each stitched by hand with silk thread, a painstaking and time-consuming task. The name tailor, or tailor, became common because, like the smith, the tailor was a necessary part of every town and large village. While the very poor might have their clothes made at home by their wives or mothers from rough cloth, anyone with any money or social ambition went to a tailor. A tailor could be a man or a woman. Many women, like Eleanor, ran successful businesses, often taking over from a deceased husband or father. The tailors' guilds were among the most powerful and well-organized of the craft guilds. In London, the guild that would become the Merchant Tailors' Company was founded in the 13th century. They regulated every aspect of the trade. They inspected the quality of materials and workmanship, ensuring that a client was not being cheated with shoddy cloth or poor sewing. They set the terms of apprenticeship, a 7-year period of training that turned a young boy or girl into a skilled craftsman. They also acted as a social and religious fraternity for their members, providing support for sick or widowed tailors. To have the surname Taylor is to be descended from someone who was an artist, a mathematician, and a business person all in one. They understood geometry in the cut of a sleeve and economics in the pricing of a gown. They were the arbiters of taste and the enforcers of the social order through the clothes they made. They could make a man look more powerful, a woman more beautiful, and the wealthy instantly distinguishable from the poor. Your ancestor, the tailor, didn't just sew clothes, they stitched together the very fabric of medieval society. Number 5, your name is Baker, because your ancestor controlled the staff of life. In the year 1320, a man named Thomas Baker woke long before the sun. His village, nestled in the rolling hills of Kent, was still dark and silent, but for Thomas, the day's work had already begun. The air in his small bakehouse was warm, filled with the comforting, dusty smell of flour. Thomas was the village baker, a man whose entire life revolved around a single, fundamental process turning grain into bread. And bread was not just a food in medieval England, it was the food. It was the staff of life, the bulk of every person's diet, from the coarsest peasant loaf to the finest white manship bread for the Lord's table. The bakehouse was a simple affair, a single room with a large, dome-shaped oven built of stone and clay dominating one wall. The night before, Thomas, or his apprentice, had loaded the oven with faggots of wood and lit a roaring fire inside it. For hours the fire burned, heating the thick stone walls until they glowed. Then the coals and ash were raked out, and the oven was sealed. The stored heat in the masonry was what would bake the bread. This method required immense skill and experience. Thomas knew by the color of the stones and the feel of the heat on his face exactly when the oven was ready. Too hot, and the loaves would burn on the outside while remaining raw inside. Too cool, and they would not rise properly. His first task of the morning was to mix the dough. He worked at a large wooden trough, a kneading trough. He mixed flour, water, salt, and his most precious ingredient, the leaven or sourdough starter. This was a piece of dough saved from the previous day's baking, a living culture of wild yeasts and bacteria that would make the bread rise and give it its distinctive flavor. He kept the starter alive day after day, year after year. It was the soul of his bakery. Kneading the dough was backbreaking work. He would fold, press, and turn the heavy, sticky mass again and again, developing the gluten in the flour until the dough was smooth and elastic. For a large batch, his apprentice would help, and they would work in rhythm, their arms and shoulders straining. While the dough rested and began its slow rise, Thomas would prepare his different types of loaves. For the common villagers, he made a dark, heavy bread called maslin. It was made from a mixture of wheat and rye flour, often with the bran still in it. It was nutritious and cheap, the staple of the peasant diet. For wealthier customers, like the parish priest or the Lord Steward, he baked wheaten bread made from more finely sifted wheat flour. And for the lord of the manor himself, he would make manchet, a small, fine loaf made from the whitest, most expensive flour, sifted multiple times through a cloth sieve. The color of your bread was a direct reflection of your social standing. Once the loaves were shaped, they went into the hot oven. Thomas used a long-handled wooden peel, a tool like a giant paddle, to slide the loaves deep into the oven's chamber. He had to work quickly to avoid losing too much heat. He would seal the oven door with a stone and a dab of wet clay, and then wait. This, too, was a matter of judgment. There were no clocks with minute hands. He timed the baking by instinct, by the smells coming from the oven, and perhaps by reciting a certain number of prayers. The life of a baker was governed by strict rules. In many villages, the lord of the manor had a monopoly on the oven, a feudal right. Peasants were often forbidden from baking in their own homes and were required to bring their dough to the official baker, paying a fee for the service. This made the baker an official and sometimes resented figure. Furthermore, the price and weight of bread were not set by the baker himself, but were regulated by the law. From the 13th century, the assize of bread and ale was in effect. This law linked the price of a loaf of bread to the price of grain. When grain was cheap, loaves had to be heavier. When grain was expensive, the weight of the loaf for the same price could be smaller. An official called the ale conner would visit the bakery with a set of standard weights to check the baker's loaves. If a baker was found to be selling underweight bread, a short loaf, the penalties were severe. He could be fined heavily, or for repeat offenses, be put in the pillory or dragged through the streets on a hurdle with the offending loaf tied around his neck. The reputation of a baker was paramount. The surname baker, therefore, arose from one of the most common and essential of all medieval professions. The Old English word was basir. Every community of any size needed a baker. He was the man who turned the raw harvest of the fields into the daily sustenance of the people. To be a baker meant your ancestor was a man of routine and skill, a master of fire and fermentation. He worked through the night so that others could have their daily bread. The name speaks of a legacy that is humble but profoundly important, a connection to the very foundation of the medieval diet and the rhythms of village life. Number 4. Your name is Clark because your ancestor was one of the few who could read. In the scriptorium of a Benedictine monastery in Durham, in the year 1250, a young man named William sat at a slanted wooden desk. His tonsured head was bent in concentration, his world narrowed to the piece of vellum in front of him and the quill pen in his hand. The only sounds were the scratching of his pen, the distant chanting of monks in the chapel, and the occasional rustle of a page being turned. William was a clerk. His name, derived from the Latin clericus, meant a clergyman, a scholar, or a scribe. In an overwhelmingly illiterate world, his ability to read and write was a rare and powerful skill, almost a form of magic. While many clerks were indeed in holy orders, the term also applied to any man who was literate and worked as a secretary, a record keeper, or an accountant. William was not yet a priest. He was in minor orders, serving the monastery as a copyist. His task today was to create a new copy of the Gospel of John for the monastery's library. The book he was copying from was ancient, its pages soft with age. His own vellum was fresh, prepared from calfskin, scraped and smoothed until it was a creamy, luminous surface. His tools were simple. His pen was a goose feather, a quill, which he had to sharpen constantly with a small knife. His ink was a deep black, made from oak galls, mixed with iron sulfate in a binder like gum arabic. He made it himself, following a recipe passed down through generations of scribes. He had other colors too for decoration, a rich red made from ground insects or minerals, and a blue from the precious lapis lazuli stone imported all the way from Afghanistan. The work was incredibly slow and demanding. He copied the Latin text letter by letter, forming each one with careful practiced strokes in the formal script of the day. A single mistake could ruin the entire page, a costly error, as a single sheet of vellum represented a significant amount of labor and expense. He had to maintain intense concentration for hours on end, his back aching, his eyes straining in the dim light that filtered through the narrow, unglazed windows. A skilled scribe like William might be able to copy 2 or 3 pages on a good day. A complete Bible could take a team of scribes more than a year to produce. But the work of a clerk extended far beyond the monastery walls. Literacy was the engine of administration for both the church and the state. Every great lord, every bishop, and the king himself employed a small army of clerks in their chancery. These clerks wrote the letters, drew up the legal charters, issued the writs, and kept the meticulous accounts upon which all power rested. A man like Geoffrey Chaucer, the great poet, spent most of his life working as a clerk and a civil servant for the king, not as a professional writer. Consider a clerk working for a town council in the 14th century. He would be responsible for recording the minutes of meetings, drafting local ordinances, and keeping the town's financial records. When a merchant sold a property, a clerk would draw up the deed of sale, a legal document that was the only proof of ownership. His handwriting had to be clear and consistent, as it was the official record. He would have to be fluent in Latin, the language of the church and law, and in Anglo-Norman French, the language of the royal court and the aristocracy. He would also need to write in the vernacular Middle English for more common communications. The name Clark or Clark became a surname because this profession set a man apart. In a village where most men were identified by their agricultural labor like farmer or shepherd, or a manual trade like smith or wright, the clerk was different. He didn't work with his hands in the same way. He worked with his mind and with language. He was often one of the most educated and respected people in the community. He might also serve as the village schoolmaster, teaching the sons of the wealthy to read and write. His skills gave him access to power. He was the one who understood the terms of the lease, who could read the letter from the bishop, who kept the records that determined who owed what in taxes. This position of trust and knowledge made the clerk an indispensable figure. So, to have the surname Clark is to have an ancestor who was part of a tiny, literate elite. He was a keeper of knowledge, a recorder of history, and a facilitator of law and commerce. His legacy is not in things made of wood or metal, but in the written words that organized and governed the medieval world. The name points to a heritage of education and administration, a link to the rare and precious power of the written word in a world that mostly could not read it. Number 3, your name is Potter because an ancestor made the dishes you ate from. In a small, smoky workshop at the edge of a village in Staffordshire in the year 1290, a man named Richard Potter sat at his wheel. His hands, caked in wet, gray clay, moved with a fluid grace that belied the strength in his fingers. The wheel, a heavy stone disc, spun steadily, powered by the rhythmic kicking of his foot on a lower treadle. Before him, a lump of shapeless clay was rising, thinning, and taking the form of a jug. Richard was a potter, a maker of the essential, everyday vessels that his community used for cooking, storing, and eating. The potter's craft was one of the most ancient, yet it was a humble one. Richard was not creating fine art. He was a manufacturer of necessities. In a world without plastic, glass, or cheap metal, pottery was the default material for most household containers. Every home needed jugs for water and ale, bowls for stew, jars for storing grain or salted butter, and cooking pots that could be placed directly on the embers of a fire. Richard's process began at the local clay pit. Not just any earth would do. He knew where to find the best seams of clay, digging it out in heavy chunks and hauling it back to his workshop in a cart. The raw clay had to be prepared, a laborious process called wedging. He would throw a large lump of it onto a stone slab, cut it in half with a wire, and slam one half on top of the other, repeating the process over and over. This removed air bubbles, which could cause a pot to explode in the kiln, and made the clay's consistency uniform. Then came the work at the wheel. This was where the magic happened. He would slam a ball of prepared clay onto the center of the spinning wheel. Wetting his hands in a bowl of water, he would center the clay, a crucial first step that required perfect balance and pressure. Then, he would press his thumb into the center, opening up the lump. With fingers inside and out, He would pull the walls of the clay upward. It was a delicate dance between the spinning of the wheel, the pressure of his hands, and the nature of the clay itself. A moment's lapse in concentration, and the wall would collapse into a useless, muddy heap. In a matter of minutes, he could transform the lump into a pitcher, a bowl, or a beaker. He would finish it by smoothing the rim, perhaps adding a few decorative lines with a wooden tool, and then expertly attach a handle he had shaped separately. Once a batch of pots was formed, they had to dry slowly in the air for several days until they were leather hard. This was when he might apply a simple glaze. The most common glaze was a lead-based one, which he would buy as a powder. He would mix it with water to form a slurry and pour it over the pots. When fired, this would create a glassy, waterproof surface, making the pot easier to clean and better for holding liquids. The final stage was the firing, the most perilous and uncertain part of the whole process. Richard's kiln was a large, wood-fired structure, essentially a big oven made of brick and earth. He would carefully stack the dried glazed pots inside, a three-dimensional puzzle where he had to ensure the hot gases could circulate evenly. Then he would seal the kiln and start the fire. For more than a day, he would have to feed the fire, slowly raising the temperature to over 1000 degrees Celsius. He judged the temperature by the color of the flame and the glow from spy holes in the kiln wall. It was a process based entirely on experience. If he raised the temperature too quickly, the pots would crack. If he didn't get it hot enough, the clay wouldn't vitrify and the glaze wouldn't melt properly. After the peak temperature was reached, the kiln had to cool down just as slowly, a process that could take 2 or 3 days. Opening the kiln was always a moment of truth. He would unbrick the entrance, and inside would be his finished wares, transformed by the fire into hard, durable ceramic. But there were always casualties, pots that had cracked, glazes that had run, or a piece that had tipped over and fused to its neighbors. A successful firing with minimal losses was a cause for celebration. The name Potter, from the Old English poter, was a common occupational surname because, like the smith and the baker, the potter's goods were needed everywhere. While a single potter might supply several villages, the trade was widespread. He would sell his wares at the local weekly market, laying them out on a blanket for housewives and farmers to inspect. A simple bowl might cost a penny, while a large decorated pitcher would be several times that. It was a steady, if not wealthy, living. And to be a potter means your ancestor was a man intimately connected to the earth. He worked with clay, water, and fire, the most basic of elements. He was a master of a process that was part science, part alchemy. His hands shaped the vessels that held the food and drink that sustained medieval life. The name is a link to a legacy of humble, essential craftsmanship to the creation of the simple functional objects that formed the backdrop of everyday existence. Number 2, your name is Miller because an ancestor was the most hated man in town. At the edge of the village of Oakhaven in the year 1345, the watermill stood as a testament to medieval technology and a source of constant friction. The river dammed to create a mill pond powered a large wooden water wheel. Inside the mill, a complex series of wooden gears and shafts transferred the wheel's power to 2 massive circular millstones. Presiding over this noisy, dusty, and powerful operation was a man named John the Miller. He was one of the most important and quite possibly one of the most disliked men in the entire village. The miller's role was absolutely vital. Grain, wheat, rye, oats, and barley was the foundation of the medieval diet. But grain in its raw form isn't edible for humans. It had to be ground into flour. The process of doing this by hand with a small quernstone was incredibly arduous and slow. The watermill or windmill represented a huge leap in productivity, able to grind in an hour what a person could grind by hand in a day. John's mill was a place of constant, deafening noise, the rush of water, the creak and groan of the wooden machinery, and the deep grinding rumble of the stones. The air was perpetually thick, with a fine white dust that coated everything and worked its way into his lungs. The work was physically demanding and dangerous. He had to haul heavy sacks of grain, adjust the massive machinery, and constantly monitor the grinding process. And a moment of inattention could lead to a jammed gear, or worse, a fire sparked by friction in the dusty air. The most skilled part of his job was dressing the millstones. The stones, huge discs of French burstone, were grooved with a pattern of fine lines cut into their faces. It was this pattern that sheared and ground the grain, Over time, the stones would wear smooth. John would have to stop the mill, use a crane to lift the top runner stone, which could weigh over a ton, and painstakingly re-chip the grooves using a hardened steel pick called a mill bill. It was precise, exhausting work. Given his essential role, why was the miller so often a figure of suspicion and hatred? The reason was economic. In most manners, the lord owned the mill. This was a banality or a feudal monopoly. The peasants of the manor were forbidden from grinding their own grain, even with hand querns, and were legally obligated to bring it to the lord's mill. And the lord's miller John was the one who enforced this monopoly. For his service, the miller was entitled to a portion of the flour he ground. This payment, called bolcher, was typically set by law or custom, often at 1/16 of the grain. This is where the trouble started. The peasants, who lived on the edge of subsistence, were intensely suspicious that the miller was taking more than his fair share. It was a system ripe for corruption. John, like all millers, was the subject of endless accusations and jokes. It was said that millers had a thumb of gold, meaning they could feel the quality of flour so well they could tell its worth, but also that they became rich by pressing their thumbs on the scale. They were accused of using false measures, of keeping a portion of the best flour for themselves, and mixing in cheaper grain, or simply of having a secret chute that diverted a little extra flour from each sack into their own private bin. Popular literature of the time, like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, portrayed the miller as a brawny, cheating, drunken lout. The reeve in the tale says of the miller, he was a thief as well of corn and meal, and that a sly one stealing was his bent. This was the common perception. Whether John was honest or not, the system made him a target. When a peasant brought a sack of grain to the mill, he had no way of knowing exactly how much flour it should produce. He simply had to trust the miller. This power imbalance bred deep resentment. Any shortfall in the final amount of flour was blamed on the miller's greed, not on a poor harvest or the quality of the grain. The surname Miller, from the Latin mullinarius, is therefore one of the most common occupational names. Like the smith, nearly every manor had a miller. But unlike the smith, whose work was seen as straightforwardly constructive, the miller's was seen as extractive. He stood at a choke point in the food supply, a middleman with the power to take a slice of every villager's livelihood. To carry the name Miller is to be descended from a figure of power and controversy. Your ancestor was a technician, a master of the most sophisticated machinery in the village. He was an entrepreneur of a sort, running a vital business, but he was also an object of suspicion, a man who profited from the labor of others in a way that was not always trusted. The name carries the echo of that grinding stone, a sound that meant both daily bread and daily resentment for the medieval peasant. Number 1, your name is Chapman because your ancestor walked the road selling the world. On a muddy track somewhere between St. Albans and London, in the spring of 1450, a man named Roger Chapman adjusted the heavy pack on his back and kept walking. A light rain was falling, turning the road into a slick mire. Roger was a Chapman, a traveling merchant. His name came from the Old English setman, a compound of seep trade or barter, and man. He was a tradesman, but not one who stayed in a single shop. His shop was the road, the market stall, and the village green. He was the human connection between the isolated villages and the wider world of goods and ideas. Life for a Chapman was hard and often dangerous. The roads were poorly maintained and infested with robbers. Roger traveled with a sturdy staff in his hand and a knife at his belt, but his best defense was to travel in the company of other merchants or pilgrims when he could. He walked dozens of miles a day in all weather, sleeping in cheap inns, in barns, or sometimes just under a tree. His pack was his entire business. It was a carefully organized treasure trove of small, high-value goods that villagers could not make for themselves. He carried needles and pins from London, a marvel of metalwork that was always in demand. He had ribbons and laces of bright colors, a small luxury for a village girl. He carried small knives, pouches, and maybe a few pairs of spectacles, a recent and wondrous invention. He might also have a small selection of spices, like pepper or ginger, bought in tiny, expensive quantities from a city apothecary. These were worth a fortune and added a dash of flavor to the monotonous peasant diet. He also carried news. He could tell the people of one village about the price of wool in the next town, or share gossip he'd heard from a traveler from a distant shire. In a world without newspapers, the chapman was a walking source of information. Roger was what was known as a peddler, a specific type of chapman who carried his goods on his back. Other chapmen might have a pack horse or even a small cart to carry more stock. They were a step up from the humble peddler, but the principle was the same. They bought goods in the larger market towns where guilds and international merchants operated and sold them at a profit in the smaller, more remote communities. The chapman's business was based on a mix of barter and coin. In a village, he might trade a handful of pins for a few eggs or a small piece of cheese which he could eat on the road. For more expensive items, he would demand coin. The circulation of money was still limited in the countryside, but the chapman was one of the forces that helped spread a cash-based economy. He was a master of salesmanship. Arriving in a village, he would find a central spot, open his pack, and lay out his wares on a cloth. His arrival was an event. He would call out in a loud voice, describing his goods in glowing terms. He was a storyteller, an entertainer, and a psychologist. He knew how to flatter a housewife into buying a new ribbon, or convince a farmer he desperately needed a new sharp knife. He haggled over every transaction, a back and forth that was part of the expected ritual of commerce. Chapmen were often seen as outsiders and were not always trusted. Like millers, they were middlemen who profited from transactions. They were sometimes accused of using false weights or selling shoddy goods. They had a reputation for being fast-talking and clever, rootless men who belonged to no particular community. But despite this suspicion, they were a necessary part of the economic landscape. They provided a vital service, bringing goods and a touch of the outside world to people whose lives were otherwise confined to a few square miles around their home village. The surname chapman, and its variant shipman, became established to describe this profession. It signifies an ancestor who lived a life of constant movement and enterprise. He was not tied to the land like a farmer or to a workshop like a craftsman. He was an adventurer in a small way, a risk-taker who lived by his wits. His success depended on his physical endurance, his knowledge of the roads and markets, and his ability to persuade people to part with their meager savings. To have the name Chapman is to have a legacy of travel, trade, and independence. Your ancestor was a vital link in the chain of medieval commerce, a man who broke the isolation of rural life. He walked the dusty, dangerous roads of medieval England, carrying not just goods in his pack, but a small piece of the wider world itself.